Good afternoon, all. It is mid-Hanukkah. Shabbat will be tomorrow night, as it comes every week. And fun little factoid, due to the arrival of Rosh Chodesh on Shabbat, if you happen to be at a Brit Milah, it will be the longest possible Birkat Hamazon. Just saying. This week, I'm going to speak both about Parshiot Mikeyz and Vayigash, doing both of them together. First of all, they do provide us with a nice unit of storytelling. And secondly, I'm taking the prerogative of just taking a vacation week next week and not really being tuned into various professional obligations I have. So I thank you for understanding ahead of time. I also want to share that as of January 1st, I am not sure whether or not this will continue to be posted on Melrose B'nai Israel's Facebook. If it is, then business as usual. If it's not, it is on my Facebook. And all you have to do is just contact my Facebook account and ask to be a friend or ask to be admitted, and I will do so. Assuming that the names look not suspicious, and I'm not going to be inviting any trolls in. So just to let you know, that's what's coming down the pike. I'm talking this week about the patterns of our lives as we have seen throughout Parshiot and the roots of generational trauma with potential for healing. In that vein, I'm going to be using a lot of different types of sources and voices in terms of psychologists and folks that look at generational trauma. So we will note that this repeated pattern of fractured or unsure relationships and their need for resolution continues. The first week after the first of the year, when we discuss Vayigash, we will leave off that focus, understand that not everything will be resolved, but we are further along than we were before. And we will move on to the dynamics of a nation. As we discussed last week, there are many sides to a story, and when that story belongs to so many different people with so many different perceptions, we understand how people come away with extremely different understandings of what has transpired, and certainly different impacts on their soul. Carol McMullen, in her well-researched work entitled Processing Trauma in the Hebrew Bible, which was published in 2019, is an important piece in which she studies generational trauma and then applies it to the families of Parshiot. I am using her teaching here. She explains as follows. Current research in the neuroscience of trauma explains many of the physical and psychological changes that occur during and after traumatic events. The trauma does not end with the cessation of the event, but rather the reaction continues. The experience of fear is the basis for many of the physical responses that can ultimately result in the phenomenon that we now know as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Increased stress hormones, cortisol in particular, elevate the heart rate and blood pressure, arterial tension, blood glucose, and fatty acid levels. Elevated cortisol can contribute to the suppression of the prefrontal cortex activity, affecting judgment and the ability to regulate our behavior and make plans for the future. Cortisol can affect the hippocampus neurons, weakening short-term memory and preventing the person from distinguishing between real and imagined threat. This will become particularly valuable in looking at these two Parshiot, weakening of short-term memory and preventing the individual from distinguishing between real and imagined threats. Serotonin levels, continues McMullen, are decreased, which can heighten feelings of anger and pain, and the world may be perceived with more negativity and suspicion. With all of this, there is a heightened sense of danger and vigilance in preventing such. She goes on to explain medically what happens and the details of what occurs within us, both physiologically, emotionally, and as well psychologically. She then goes on to think about our friends in Parshiot. She says, it is instructive to consider some of the biblical characters who may possibly have been affected thus. Several studies suggest that survivors' guilt is a common and distressing problem amongst survivors of various disasters. Noah was engaged in seemingly bizarre projects with this art building initiative, which attracted the negative attention and outright scorn of his community over a protracted period, forcing them, in a sense, to retract into their own negative behaviors and him to distance himself even further, which may explain why this absence of concern for others occurs. In other words, what she is suggesting is that we don't look at these just as the text as the words, but as we discussed last week, what is the text? What is the subtext? What's underneath the words? If we're going to look at Noah as a person with limitations as we have described, we also need to look at Noah as an individual who can react to what is going on. He is being burdened during this time, knowing about the impending doom of the entire human race. She likens this to a parent who knows that there is a terminal diagnosis for a child, but waits decades for the impending tragedy to occur. Noah may have suffered from survivor's guilt and faced the uncertainty and the fear of the unknown future after the immediate flood crisis was over. And this is according to Jonathan Sachs. Within the context of this, yet another person who is studying the psychology of biblical characters suggests that Noah was drunk to the point of falling naked into his tent because anxiety, being overwhelmed, depression, we all know, leads to these behaviors. This correlates with our more recent research that suggests that substance abuse issues are often correlated with PTSD reactions. We continue with the teaching of McMullen. Jacob seems to have carried forward his father's legacy. He was also unable to effectively parent his own 12 sons, and he suffered deeply from the loss of his favorite son, Yosef, who was sold into slavery by his brothers and presumed dead and dismembered and completely obliterated, as we discussed last week. When Yaakov's sons slaughtered the men of Shechem following what they perceived to be the sexual assault of Dinah, his mild reproof, i.e. his silence, is focused more on family reputation than on the moral atrocity committed. We do not see Yaakov reaching out to his daughter. He seems, says McMullen, to be psychologically damaged, not able to process emotions of fear or anger. And this, again, is similar to what we know about PTSD. Some might relate his vision of the latter and perceived struggle with the angel to this condition as well. Yaakov appears to be blocking painful memories, both from his youthful deceit and terrifying escape from Esav, and of his son's serial misdeeds, until the blessings that he gives them on his deathbed. And thinking in these terms, we look at those blessings differently. For Vayigash, the title is going to be Blessings and Challenges. In other words, The blessing is not always as we think about it in these positive, glowing, aspirational terms, but it may in fact be more of, this is what I know your challenge is. I wish you the best possible. Think of those of us as parents who have children who have received every possible blessing, every possible advantage in the world, and then something in that child takes that child on a different path. And many times the parent will feel disappointment, whereas the child does not see those blessings as positive things or as things that contribute to their life. Here we are looking, friends, at the stuff of real living, our well-being or lack thereof. We are acutely aware that unresolved issues in former generations will continue to present in those to come. Our family legacies are indeed filled with, and too often at least somewhat identified, by continued generational trauma. Aviva Zornberg, whom I've been using a great deal in these Parshiot discussions, explains that Yosef will continue this living with unresolved issues in his own life, even pointing to Yosef's naming of his own sons as indicative of this legacy of trauma. She explains that nowhere does Yosef reveal as nakedly his own strange feelings about the vicissitudes of his own life as he does in these names. Who has been totally removed from his family, his most important support system, will now be the head of a new family. How will he parent? Where did he learn to do so? And what did he learn about parenting and family relations? What hopes are being transitioned and placed on his children? What residual effects of the trauma that have been part of his experience? We read in chapter 40, verses 51 and 52, Vayikra Yosef et Shem HaBechor Menashe, Ki Nasani Elokim et Kol Amali ve'et Kol Beit Avi. And Yosef names the firstborn Menashe because God has caused me, Ki Nisani, God has caused me to forget all of my amalim, all of my troubles, and everything about Beit Avi, my father's house. We talked earlier in Bereshit about Avram leaving physically his father's home and that impact. Here, he in effect is thrown out of the family. And that has a whole other level of impact. Vet Shema Sheni Kara Ephraim, Ki Hifrani Elokim Be'eretz Onyeh. The second one he names Ephraim, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. In other words, what Yosef is saying here, and it will be amplified later when he says, it's not you who sent me here, brothers, it's God, is that with each trauma also does come something that looks like or feels like a blessing. And we know this is true. If we all think of our lives and the traumas that our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents went through in order to put us in this place at this time in this space, and whatever blessings we have may be directly connected to the trauma of those on whose shoulders we stand. For Yosef, he has suffered both at the hands of his own siblings and family, in the name Menashe, and in the land in which he lives, in Egypt, evoked in Ephraim. Now, after all of this, he is in a position of power. What happens to people that are placed in positions of power after such suffering? How does this abrupt change in circumstances potentially influence the course of events that are now fueled by Yosef's own initiatives? Chris Betteroff from NPR suggests the following, regarding the impact of power. He says, even the smallest dose of power can change a person. You've probably seen it. Someone gets a promotion or a bit of fame, and then suddenly they're a little less friendly to the people beneath them. So here's a question that may seem just too simple. Why? If you ask a psychologist, he or she may tell you that the powerful are simply too busy. They don't have the time to fully attend to their less powerful counterparts. But if you ask Sagavir Abhi, a neuroscientist at the Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada, he will give you another explanation. Power fundamentally changes how the brain operates, similar to how trauma does. Continuing, Obi and his colleagues, Jeremy Hogveen and Michael Einschlat, have a new study showing evidence that support this claim. They have randomly put participants in the mindset of feeling either powerful or powerless. They asked the powerless group to write a diary entry about a time they depended on others for help. The powerful group writes entries about times they were calling the shots. The powerless group writes about times when others impacted on their destiny. End of quote. The words that were used in the self-esteem or lack thereof that they indicate were quite clear and differentiated in the writings in this research. External circumstances and the standing of individuals in those circumstances produced qualitatively different experiences and different perceptions of those experiences. Again, there's nothing surprising here. The challenge, I believe, for us as students of Torah is to look underneath the words, as we spoke last week, and to see these dynamics as operative and be willing and able to read them into these narratives, not judging too harshly, not being too quick to choose the good and the bad, but really trying to be empathic towards the different experiences that are evoked on a common stage. The break between Mikeyz and Vayigash is certainly full of this dramatic tension. What will happen to the brothers in Egypt? What is Yosef's position at this point? Is there anything strange about the actions he takes? How do we explain them? Well, it's lovely to look at this as the paradigmatic rags to riches story, which many do, and then in so doing comparing it to the story of Esther. They romanticize. But let's consider another part of the equation. How do past generations of trauma express themselves and respond to a sudden shift in a position of power? We're going to bring another psychologist into the discussion. This one is named Mary Slaughter, and she teaches. In study after study, Pamela Smith of University of California, San Diego, and researchers like her started piecing together evidence for the profound ways that holding power, whether through experimental manipulation or real-life experiences, changes the way people process their worlds in ways that explain not only corporate greed or erratic executive behavior, but sexual harassment. Power is non-conscious. It is an artificial construct. Smith and her colleagues have found we can have power and absorb his cognitive effects without even realizing that we're doing so. Other researchers have found that powerful people consider other people's perspectives less important and significant, and that the experience of this power increases their optimism and the feeling of being betrayed or left behind by the others. It gives people an illusory sense of control over what will happen. While we don't have all the answers, we have started organizing the literature on power and found 4 ways that its cognitive effects explain harassment. These categories may provide a better conceptual framework that we have than that which we have today for understanding what power does to people and how to maximize its positive qualities, curb its dangers, and therefore encourage people with power to work in a positive realm for the good of all, as opposed to for their own aggrandizement. Let us consider what happens at the end of this parsha in chapter 44. And as we do so, let us be mindful of the factors of trauma and its lasting impact on Yosef, his use of power he has acquired, and the complete undoing of the well-being of so many here. We begin with verse 1. He commands the overseer of his house, saying, "Fill the men's sacks," his brothers, "with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money into the mouth of its sack." So first of all, Yosef is in this power position, and he's telling other people what to do, and the brothers will get what they get by dint of his power. And then he says, "And my goblet, kesef, tasim b'fi amtachat hakatan." My goblet, place in the sack of the youngest. And the servant did as Yosef said. The morning becomes light. The men are ready to set on their way. They exit the city. They're ready to go. And they go, "Stop. Something's wrong here. My goblet is missing. Why did you do this to me? Why did you repay my good? Lama shilamtem ra'at tova, with bad, with evil." Now, when one compares this conversation and interaction with those of Moshe Rabbeinu, one sees a stark difference. Here we understand the real characteristic most admirable in Moshe. In spite of his position of power, we are told continually, Hu ha'ish hanavav, he is the most humble person amongst all. And it is precisely this reason that God will speak with Moshe face to face. Because even in power, he exudes humility. They find the money in one of the sacks, and Yosef says, "Whichever one of your servants with whom it is found shall die, and will also be slaves." And of course, it goes on, and we know this whole drama unfolds. They search the eldest, they go down, and then they find the goblet in Binyamin's sack. So they rent their garments, Vayikra'u simlatam, kind of a similar reaction. Of course, we understand to rent when you're mourning, but Binyamin is not dead. But frankly, Yosef wasn't dead either, but they are presumed as dead. And when someone is presumed as dead and they come back with this news to Yaakov, you understand the reaction. The trauma is horrible. That's one of the reasons, interestingly enough, in halacha, when somebody kidnaps another person, they are subject to the same penalty as someone who kills another person. Now, you may think, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. If you kidnap and you return the person, then all is good. The event is over, right? But we know that that's not the case. That is PTSD. Judah and his brothers come to Yosef's house. They fall before him on the ground. Yosef says to them, "What is this deed that you have committed to me?" Yehuda says, "What shall we say to you? How shall we speak? How do we exonerate ourselves? You have found us guilty." And then he says, take me. And different brothers try to come up with different solutions. And he says, "No. The man in whose possession the goblet was found, he shall be my slave. But as for you, go in peace to your father." Aviva Zornberg, in her book, Parshiot, The Beginning of Desire, shows us that after the brothers are accused of stealing the goblet, there are several different claims about what the proper response should be. In chapter 44, verse 9, the brothers say that the guilty one should die and the rest should become slaves. In the next verse, the steward then replies, it says, "No, the guilty will become a slave and the rest will go free." A few psukim later, in verse 16, the goblet is found in Binyamin's sack, and Yosef directly confronts them. Yehuda now changes his plea and says that all of the brothers should become slaves. And then in verse 17, the steward says, Yosef again will say that only the guilty should become a slave and the rest should go free. At this point, we have Yehuda's very long speech to Yosef, opening Parshiot Vayigash, because that's the point that everything is left out in Mikeyz. Yehuda doesn't actually discuss the goblet at all, but instead reflects on the narrative of the family from which they all come. The incident of the goblet is not as critical as the memory of the generations to which we are linked. And at the end, Yehuda one last time changes his appeal. This time he says, at the end of chapter 44 and verse 33, "Keep me as the slave. Let Binyamin go free with the other brothers." This final request at the end of his speech is what causes Yosef to break down and reveal himself to his brothers. What was it in Yehuda's words that led to this reversal? How does his response change from those appropriate to his new power position to that of a child mourning the loss of his family? What lessons are here for all of us in terms of thinking about our lives and what we have achieved, while interfacing that with and acknowledging the past that may define us and certainly confirms from where we come? In Parshiot, Parak 45, we read, "Now Yosef could not bear all of those standing and witnessing the scene, so he says, using his power, 'Take everyone away from me!' And he is left standing there with his brothers. He now makes himself known to his brothers. He weeps out loud so that the Egyptians heard and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Yosef says to his brothers at this point, 'Ani Yosef, ha'od avichai, v'lo yachlu achiv la'anot oto, k'nifalu mipanav.' I'm Joseph. Is my father alive?" But his brothers could not answer. Now they're the ones who are traumatized. Yosef then says to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they draw closer. And he says, "Ani Yosef, achichem asher machartem oti mitzrayma. V'ata al ta'atzvu, v'al yichar beinechem, ki machartem oti, hina ki lemechaya shelachani Elokim lifnechem." Joseph says to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they come closer. "I am Yosef, who you sold into Egypt. But now don't be sad. Don't be troubled that you sold me here, for God sent me before you in order to preserve everyone." So Yosef now is, let's, for sake of argument, say past the trauma, not exercising power as such. He is a son, he is a brother who is working toward reconciliation. And in doing so, acknowledges that, as we asked the question last week, yes, this is a setup. God ordained all of this. Now again, many of our commentators prefer to read this with a romantic and a nostalgic eye, which we have discussed in past years, all informed by God's directing of the events and timing that is ordained by Hashem. However, at what point do we discuss the actions attributed to human beings and interfacing these two dynamics is what we see in Yosef's statement. You did what you were supposed to do. God orchestrated it. I'm here to save you. But there's a focus here begging for our attention, namely that of memory and the pain of those memories. Zornberg talks at length about the burim, the pits of Yosef's experiences. First, the bore, the pit into which his brothers threw him, and then the bore, the prison into which he is thrown in Mitzrayim, both of which we read about last week. The very land of his straits, his challenges, his narrow escapes. The depths of these pits are parallel to the depths of Yosef's internal pits, the depths to which he may have sunk or been thrown into despair. He is powerless when he's thrown into the pit by his brothers. He is powerless when he is thrown into the dungeon in Egypt. His own trauma is paralleled by, and perhaps even foreshadowed by, none other than his father, Yaakov, whom we note in this portion of Mikeyz. In chapter 42, we read, "Bring your youngest brother to me so that I will know you are not spies," this is Yosef, "that you are honest. But then I will give you your brother, and you may travel around the land." And it comes to pass that they are each emptying their sacks, and behold, each one's bundle of money is in their sack. They saw the bundles of their money, they and their father, and they became frightened. And their father, Yaakov, says to them, "You have bereaved me. Shikaltem oti." Yosef is gone. Shimon is gone because Shimon is being held. And now you want me to take Benjamin from me? All these troubles have come upon me. And Reuben speaks to him and says, "You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring Benjamin back. Put him into my hands and I will return him to you." But Yaakov says, "My son will not go down with you," because as far as Yaakov knows, his brother is dead and he alone is left from his wife Rachel. "And if misfortune falls upon him, you will bring down my head in sorrow to the grave." Clearly, this is a family in complete disarray. So much has been lost on so many levels. So many relationships have been severed. And while we get some insight into the narrative about Yaakov, Yosef, Reuven, Yehuda, and others through the words we have, we must again wonder what is behind and what is underneath the words we see. What pain and unrestrained generational trauma about broken relationships. Again, a father who puts his own 2 sons at risk for the sake of saving his brother. Again, repeating that pattern. What we can share are the lessons that we extract from these difficult challenges that we confront. And in turn, we are forced to confront ourselves. What exactly was Yaakov's inner journey? What was Yosef's inner journey? How are these represented in their outer journeys? While we love the feel-good notion of speaking of their internal strength, hashkafa prati, and faith in God, I would suggest that there is a larger lesson here which we must not ignore, and that is the lesson of the borim, the pits into which we are thrown in our lives and how we emerge from them. Our generational stories are filled with these borim, as is the case in our family here in Parshiot and its generations. And it is in confronting these aspects of the generational traumas that define our families and experiences, it is only there that we have any hope for true healing to occur. Not through solutions and neat and pretty and nostalgic endings, but through the lessons learned and the resolution they teach us to incorporate as we continue our own journeys. I wish you all the joy and brightness of the Hanukkah lights, the peace and the tranquility of the Shabbat candles. I wish you all a meaningful and hopefully successful 2023. And I will see you again in 2 weeks. Lehitraat.